was talking to you 20 or 30 years ago, you might be relieved to know, that would be the end of it. I could sit down and say, just go out there and make your own judgment. Be rebels. What stories are we going to cover? What angles are we going to take? It's for you to decide. But speaking to you now, there are a couple of other things that need to be said. Because in the last 20 or 30 years, something very alarming has happened, which is that the selective judgments which are central to all our work, masquerading as objectivity, are not even being taken, by and large, by journalists. More and more they're being taken by outsiders in the form of the public relations industry. So in the book, we discovered that in the output of quality newspapers and those broadcast bulletins, 54% of what we've been presented as news stories were, in fact, wholly or mainly the product of the PR industry. And when you say wholly their product, what that is about is press releases appearing verbatim in national newspapers. Mainly means that it's probably their verbatim, but we got a quote from the other side, right? The PR industry works in the interests of the government department or the corporation or the trade union or whoever who has hired it. And it's extremely dangerous. It's absolutely fatal to the business of truth-telling if instead of running stories which have been chosen in all these various departments to serve the interests of our readers and viewers and listeners, we choose stories which have been selected, all those selective judgments, to serve the political or commercial interests of the people who are hiring the PR, right? Can I give you an example of this? Because those of you who've worked as hacks for a long time will know that if you stick a press officer in a corner with an embarrassing and hostile question, that press officer may well lie to you. But that's not the common currency of what PR people do. Most PR people, most of the time, tell the truth. But it's truth that's selected to serve their interests. And a rather interesting example of this is the whole furore over Andrew Gilligan, David Kelly, and the Hutton inquiry. If you go back to the beginning of that, you have the invasion of Iraq in March 2003. 2 or 3 months pass. Various donkeys in the House of Commons get up on their hind legs and go, hang on a minute, where are those weapons of mass destruction? We were told they were there. And the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, if you remember, in the June, decided to hold an inquiry about the information which had been provided by government to the people and to Parliament and the press, and whether or not it was true. And right up there on the top of their witness list was Alistair Campbell, Downing Street's PR man, right at the heart of what I'm talking about. So, if you talk to PR people, it's very useful if you're a reporter to talk to PR people privately to find out how they see the world and how they operate. They will tell you that one of their explicit rules is, if you're asked a question to which you do not have a decent answer, answer a different question. So that's why when John Humphrys is interviewing the minister on the Today programme, he starts off by saying, let me start off by saying, when John Humphrys puts a difficult question, he simply switches off and answers a different question. Okay. So Alistair is called to give evidence at the Select Committee. And the question which he is being asked is, did you lie to us? Right? The question which he answers is, did the BBC lie to us? And he does this in various cunningly manipulative ways. The PR industry is manipulative, and it's very, very successful at manipulating reporters. So the first thing he does, if you remember, is he gives all his best sound bites to answering the question that he hasn't been asked. He's doing this, banging the table. I'm going to go on and on and on until the BBC admit that they lied. Right? Now, this is an extraordinary thing to do because that report by Andrew Gilligan had been put out 7 weeks earlier. At the time that the report went out, Alistair had written a letter to the BBC saying, that's a lot of bollocks, another technical term, withdraw it. But he was writing letters like that almost every 48 hours at that time. And there had been no more heard of it. He hadn't bothered following up the letter. He'd had lunch with several senior BBC people a couple of weeks later, including Kevin Marsh, who was editing Today, and Richard Sambrook, the head of news. He hadn't even mentioned this notorious story. Here we are, weeks later, suddenly it's the thing that he's banging on about. Okay. And he comes out of giving his evidence, and he does another strange thing, apart from giving it the best sound bites. Do you remember he wrote a letter to Greg Dyke, the Director General? Dear Greg, how dare you put out this story without apologising? I'm going to go on and on until you withdraw it. And then he does another odd thing. He feeds the letter to the Press Association, our primary source of bent news, flat earth news, right? So that comes through. So what he's doing is to fabricate news coverage. He is manipulating us. And in The Guardian that evening, there was a debate about it. What do we do? Do we go with the story which Alistair is creating, the big row between the BBC and the government, or do we go with the story we're supposed to be covering about whether or not the government lied to us? And we split the difference. We gave the front page over to Alistair's story, and we did a leader comment saying, well, actually, the real story is why they lied to us, different thing. So we kind of compromised. And then do you remember the next day, he went into the Channel 4 news studio while they were on air, and said, I need to be taken on. And he sort of gate crashed the bulletin. So suddenly he was there, and he had his pen out, and he was stabbing the air again, like stabbing Gilligan in the air like this. And the next day, various hacks wrote, oh, Alistair Campbell's blown it this time, made a terrible mess. He's made himself the story. Rubbish. He's not made a mistake. He understands exactly what he's doing. He's fabricating a second 24-hour period of coverage. And by the time he's done that, by the time he's manipulated us for 48 hours, we're off. He has chosen what story we will cover, and with what angle, and with what language, and with what quotes, mostly from himself. And we're off, right? And you know, there's old black and white films. There's a kind of classic image of the media at work, which is the printing presses turning over. And tomorrow's front page comes swirling out onto the... Well, that is no longer the sound of the press at work. The sound of the press at work is this. Meh, meh. As hundreds of sheep are guided down the wrong route by the PR industry, making these selective judgments for us, while we stand up and say, oh, yeah, we're reporting the world objectively. What a joke. Now, if the PR industry is primarily about... Because what Alistair was saying was true, right? It's about selecting the truth, which he wants us to cover over and over again. 54% of our stories, wholly or mainly, put up to us by the PR industry. There is another little industry working on the side, which you will read, whose product you will frequently read about in the paper, and which occasionally you will find yourself covering, which is the world of propaganda. Now, if PR is primarily about selecting truths, propaganda is about the creation of brazen fiction to be injected into our media outlets. And if you look at it historically, there was masses of propaganda activity by military and intelligence agencies during the Cold War. And then it peaked and fell away when the Soviet Union collapsed and the budgets of those organizations tended to be shrunk. What has been scandalously little observed is that since September 2001, the business of propaganda has experienced a huge revival. And if you know what you're looking for, you can see this garbage stuff being pumped into our news columns. And partly to give my voice a rest, I wanted to play you, if the equipment works, a wee clip or two. This is the first clip I want to play you, if it will work, is about Cold War propaganda. And it comes from that brilliant series that Adam Curtis made for BBC Two a few years ago called The Power of Nightmares. And the time frame here is, this is the early 1980s. Ronald Reagan has just been elected for the first time, so I think that makes it actually 1980. And as the new administration are moving in to take over in Washington, D.C., a book is published called The Terror Network by a woman called Claire Sterling, a freelance journalist. And this book alleges all of the terrorist groups in the world at that time, the Provisional IRA, the Palestinians and the lot, are all secretly being organized and funded by Moscow. Okay, so now there's a debate within the new Reagan administration where there's a bunch of people, the neoconservatives, they had that expression, some of the same individuals back then. The neocons are saying, we've got to use the material in this book to go after the Russians and stop them funding all these terrorist groups. And there's another group of people saying, whoa, don't do that. So it's about that debate. There's a law in the United States, the 1948 Smith-Mundt Act, which makes it illegal for them to put propaganda into their own media outlets. So they plant it over here, and then they get it back in the American media by what they call blowback, which is that American journalists follow up our stories, simple as that. So we are a recognized planting ground for fictional stories created by military and intelligence agencies. And the point is that this has taken off since September the 1st and the terrorist attacks. There was a phase when the propaganda industry, it doesn't call itself the propaganda industry, there was a phase when they were calling it perception management, which is actually a brilliantly accurate way of describing what they're doing to us. They're managing our perception of events. Nowadays they call it strategic communications. It's very, very big. And just to remind you where we are here, and not to think I've got lost, this is the second of those golden rules, the idea of being objective. Once you start to pull it apart, what I'm arguing is that what you see is under the mask of objectivity. What you're finding is all sorts of selective judgments being made by the consensus, by PR, by propaganda, for us, utterly distorting our function as truth tellers. And there's a few more things I want to add. But propaganda, I'm rather interested in the subject, so I'm going to burble on about it for a few minutes. If you go back to the first Gulf War, oh no, hang on, let me just tell you this first. You know, if you've read the book, you know that in there I talk about the way that PR companies create grassroots organizations to campaign on behalf. So you turn on the telly and there's a sad lady saying, oh, I'm dying of some terrible illness. I wouldn't die if the government would license this drug, but they don't like me. It's all a postcode lottery. Well, over and over again, you'll find she belongs to a patient's pressure group, which has been created and funded and directed by the PR company acting for the pharmaceutical company who own the drug they want licensed. And in the United States, there are so many of these phony grassroots groups. They have a special little name for them in the PR world. They call them AstroTurf groups because the grassroots aren't real. Okay, and AstroTurf also, you find this overlaps between PR techniques and propaganda. So the most powerful AstroTurf group I've come across is the Iraqi National Congress, which was so influential. The organization of Iraqi exiled politicians, which was hugely influential on intelligence agencies and government and on media as a source of information. That organization was created, fabricated by a PR guy called John Rendon, who's absolutely at the heart of propaganda, who I met while I was researching the book. And he started off life as Jimmy Carter's spin doctor during the Democrat election campaign that Carter won. But since the late 80s, he's been working on contract for the CIA and the State Department and the Pentagon, doing this. I mean, he's doing this to us, fabricating these stories. So he was given the contract in the late 90s to manage global perception of Saddam Hussein's regime. So he says, we need a story, we need some human beings. Okay, we'll call it the Iraqi National Congress. I've got this budget, I'll hire Ahmed Chalabi, who was the leader of it. I'll hire this guy and this guy, call them the Central Committee, let's have a conference. We'll have it in London, I'll write their speeches for them, they will give them, the hacks will come and reproduce them. This is the fabrication of news as propaganda. If you go back to the first Gulf War, do you know these stories? There were stunning examples of propaganda at work there. I'll tell you just on the assumption that not all of you know this stuff because it's fun. The sequence of events is that Saddam Hussein goes into Kuwait, captures the country. The Kuwaiti royal family flee and go to Washington, D.C. And they say to the then president, Bush Sr., we've got to go in and kick him out. Bush says, fine, we'll do that. We'll take the oil as well. So they say, but we need global public opinion on our side, and specifically we need allies to send various troops and hardware as well. So we need a little bit of what we call propaganda. So the Kuwaiti royal family provide a budget from their back pockets of $14 million for the company who were then the world's biggest PR agency, Hill & Knowlton, a particularly despicable crew, if I may say. And they engaged in propaganda activity on behalf of the Kuwaitis. The first thing they did was to set up an AstroTurf called Citizens for a Free Kuwait. And this runs around the country doing various things in schools and with the media. And the most powerful single thing they did was to organize hearings on Capitol Hill, which were called the Human Rights Caucus, which sounds kind of official, but all it means is that Hill & Knowlton have rented a room and a table and a couple of politicians in blue blazers and invited all the hacks in, the camera crews and you guys with your notebooks, and then supplied human interest stories, witnesses who can tell the assembled masses what's been going on with the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait. And there were various witnesses who appeared. The most powerful was a 15-year-old girl. This is the thing that some of you may have heard about, but I'll tell you anyway. A 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl who appeared and very, very nervous and close to tears throughout her testimony. And it was explained that she couldn't give her full name for fear of reprisals against her family back in Kuwait. And so, sobbing as she spoke, she explained that on the day that the Iraqi troops had arrived in Kuwait City, she had been in the central hospital, in the maternity unit, and had seen the Iraqi soldiers going into the room where they had the incubators with the prematurely born babies, where the troops, the Iraqis, had taken the tiny babies out of their incubators and hurled them to the ground, to their death. And that story is picked up by the hacks, and it goes around the world, and if you talk about perception management, that's very, very powerful as a piece of perception management. And eventually, Allied public opinion comes in behind George Bush. Okay. Now, as soon as the story escapes from the mouth of this witness, the reporters in the room should be skeptical, because propaganda and dead babies are very, very close friends and always have been. If you go back to the First World War, as the Prussians sweep north through Belgium, what have they got on the end of their bayonets? Why, it's dead babies. So it was with this, that a year or two later, about 2 years later, an American journalist called John MacArthur, who wrote a very good book called Second Front, which is all about propaganda activity around the First Gulf War, John MacArthur established that this was all fiction. This girl was not who she said she was. She was, in truth, the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to Washington, D.C. And when the Iraqis arrived in Kuwait City, she hadn't been in Kuwait or Kuwait City or in the hospital or anything. She'd been in Washington, D.C. The whole story was fiction, written by a Hill & Knowlton executive who's identified in John MacArthur's book. It's like a soap opera script, fabricated, and then we ingest it and reproduce it and spray it all around the world with whatever damage it does. And I'll move on from propaganda in a minute, but I just want to say it's almost like these people who are doing this are laughing at us, because there seems to be no limit to the extremeness and stupidity of the stories which they will put out. And in the world of journalism, where we're not given the job, the time or resources or skills to do our job properly, we just bang it out. I'll just give you one tiny example, which I pulled off the website of the Melbourne Age newspaper.